Awesome. Thanks everyone for coming tonight. Tonight's discussion is on unions, protests, and direct action, lessons from the anti-uranium movement. And tonight I'll be focusing on the high point of the anti-uranium movement, which was in the 1970s. Now, if you've come to hear particularly about the campaign in the 19s, unfortunately I won't be focusing on that in my talk. However, I encourage comrades who are familiar with that campaign to also talk about that potentially in the discussions, because there's also very rich lessons from that campaign, and particularly the centrality and the ability to bring together union activists, environmentalists, and Aboriginal people, and the leadership of the Mirarr people in particular in that particular campaign against the Jabiluka uranium mine. Now, in the I guess saying that, I also want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of as the traditional custodians of these lands, and acknowledge that, you know, from the campaign against the Jabiluka mine onwards, actually there has been that really rich history of Aboriginal resistance to mining and nuclear waste and militarism on country, and that's, you know, continued. And that unity in action has also continued with, you know, the unions New South Wales showing solidarity with the Aboriginal people in their struggle against the Pilliga, the Narrabri gas project in the Pilliga, and also I think we saw that solidarity at the recent Pine Gap convergence as well, with the anti-war activists coming together and also reading out a statement from the MUA that was showing solidarity with that opposition to militarism on stolen land. Now, today I'll be talking about that 1970s campaign. In the 1970s, activists built an inspiring movement against plans to massively expand uranium mining across the continent. At its peak, this grassroots campaign brought thousands of people into mass protests in major cities and combined militant direct action with union bans at wharves, railways, and workplaces. Together, these actions and this movement put a major spanner in the works of the ruling class's nuclear ambitions. With Anthony Albanese continuing to pump billions of dollars into militarism, with the centerpiece of this being the AUKUS nuclear submarine deal, which would see Australia supplied with some 11 Virginia-class nuclear-powered submarines in preparation for war with China, there's a particular relevance to going back and looking at the rich history of the anti-uranium movement. That history also has rich lessons for the wider anti-war and Palestine movements today. Again, coming out of that 600-strong convoy to Pine Gap, which really helped expose that facility's critical role in US imperialist aggression and in Israel's genocide. That movement, you know, this movement that we're seeing at the moment is currently at a place of kind of grappling with where to go from here. How do we build sustained opposition to imperialism and war, and how do we bring that opposition into the unions, into the wider working class movement, and build to a point where we can see those stoppages that we saw around, you know, questions of uranium, and that we've also seen around Palestine and other parts of the world. So the plans to massively expand uranium in the 70s, I think, also have to be understood as part of a much wider nuclear agenda that stretched back to the end of the Second World War. When the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing around 250,000 people, instead of our ruling classes and the ruling classes over the world recoiling in horror, they responded by embarking on a nuclear arms race, which Australia really didn't want to be left out on. They saw in the atomic bomb, they saw the most advanced weapon to be able to threaten and to be able to expand their imperialist, conquest around the world, and so they try to grasp every opportunity to develop nuclear weapons of their own. So what we saw was over the following 3 decades, Australian governments making repeated efforts to join the nuclear club. I've passed around, I've got 3 copies, but it's going around of just instances of Australia's efforts to do that. And I guess the important thing to say as part of that is that, the questions of nuclear mining, testing, energy, and even so-called proposals around so-called peaceful nuclear explosions to construct harbors and canals. It sounds pretty ridiculous when you're talking about that now. All of those things were part and parcel of a project of trying to normalize nuclear technology and to try to advance Australia's acquisition of nuclear weapons of their own. And in that way, AUKUS actually represents the most ambitious move by the Australian ruling class in recent years to lay the foundations for a potential nuclear arsenal in the future, as well as really in itself representing a direct escalation of conflict with China. So just quickly, the submarines are said to be equipped with precision-guided Tomahawk missiles, which are by no means defensive, but they can also be re-equipped with nuclear weapons. Their fuel, which is made up of highly enriched uranium, can also be repurposed for weaponry. And under the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, non-nuclear armed signatories such as Australia can remove nuclear materials from formal international oversight if those materials are being used for naval propulsion. So this is really, you can really see how that's part and parcel of a project of trying to acquire nuclear weaponry as well. So resistance to this longer nuclear agenda began relatively early, developing through the 1950s and 60s as sections of the left broke with the Communist Party of Australia. Taking inspiration from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, or CND, in Britain, activists in Australia rejected the common idea at the time that nuclear weapons should simply be viewed through the lens of the Cold War, instead campaigning for unilateral nuclear disarmament. According to one academic at the time, the 1960s saw small groups of students, white-collar professionals, and some middle-class activists start to form campaigns that were at the time exclusively focused on opposing nuclear weapons and technology. And so you saw CND groups pop up in Melbourne, Brisbane, Sydney, and Perth in the early 60s. But soon as anti-Vietnam War sentiment and the campaign against conscription kind of came about, that was overshadowed by that at the time. So when the high point of the anti-uranium campaign came about in the 70s, which I'll turn to, that had been off the back of a whole range of other social movements that campaign intersected with. And so these included the anti-Vietnam War movement, the women's liberation movement, gay liberation, and Aboriginal struggles for land rights. And importantly, the anti-uranium campaign also developed during a period of relative working class confidence and self-activity. There was significant labour unrest throughout the 70s, with workers taking on the government employers in major disputes, which included a 10-day fuel strike by refinery workers in 1970, and the massive Medibank strike in 1976. Also, under the leadership of Jack Mundy and the Builders Labourers Federation, construction workers in New South Wales and Victoria also took strike action in support of social and political causes, including most famously the protection of the environment and LGBT rights. So these workers and those struggles provided a living example of what was possible when workers were prepared to use their collective power for social and political causes. So workers understood that they possessed a particular kind of power, the power to interrupt the flow of profits, and sections of them were prepared to use that power for the betterment of society. And so, in terms of the 1970s, when that movement came about, it was a situation where, and this situation remains the case, where Australia holds over a third of the world's uranium deposits. But until around the 1970s, uranium mining had only really taken off at a very small scale here. And so, as the 70s came around, that changed, and the ruling class started making a concerted push to massively expand the industry. Even Gough Whitlam, who'd been actually elected on a platform of opposition to nuclear weapons and support for ratifying the treaty, supported the expansion of a domestic nuclear power industry, the construction of uranium enrichment facilities, and the expansion of uranium exports. After coming into the power through the deposition of Whitlam, the Liberal government under Malcolm Fraser really set out to roll out the red carpet for a nuclear program. And in that, he largely ignored warnings that were contained in a report commissioned by Whitlam and published in 1977 that recommended extensive restrictions and conditions on uranium mining. And this really infuriated the ordinary people and kind of sparked the first attempts at building opposition. The first kind of initiatives were meetings and campaigning by groups such as, which we will all know now, Friends of the Earth. In Melbourne, they held a protest meeting in 1974, and that same year they started lobbying Labour MPs and union leaders and received a fairly warm response. Opposition to nuclear and uranium mining was already bubbling away within the unions and among Labour's rank and file. According to one historian, a conference of power workers in New South Wales in September of 1974 told the press that under no circumstance would they work on any nuclear power stations until the problem of nuclear pollution had been solved. The same conference also called on the ACTU, the peak body of Australian trade unions, to ban construction of nuclear power stations. The following months, representatives of Friends of the Earth, the Australian Conservation Foundation, and the ACTU met to discuss placing a green ban, placing a union ban on uranium exports. They discussed the need to focus on health hazards associated with nuclear technology and the problems posed by nuclear waste storage. December that same year, a meeting of unions in the transport, manufacturing, and construction industries called on the ACTU to impose a black ban on the development, mining, treatment, and export of uranium. Despite the best efforts by the Labour leadership to suppress the issues, and I think in ways that really parallel what we saw at the most recent ALP conference around suppressing the issue of Palestine, at this conference uranium came up, and a motion calling on the ban on uranium mining pending an inquiry was defeated. However, delegates did vote against the construction of nuclear power stations. Bob Giles, the federal president of the Plumbers Union at the time, criticized Whitlam's trip to Europe to promote uranium mining, and he summed up his positions very clearly, declaring there's only one responsible use for uranium, that is to leave it in the ground. That became the mantra of the movement that developed out of that. And all of this kind of bubbling away set the stage for the formation of MUAM, the Movement Against Uranium Mining, in 1976. That kind of happened as those different groups of activists and organizations came together and to adopt that slogan. At the time, there's already widespread public concern around nuclear power, but opposition to mining and exporting uranium was much, much less. So according to one poll published in 1977, only a third of people opposed uranium mining and exports at the time. So the movement faced a significant political challenge in terms of actually spreading that minority opposition into mass majority opposition. The campaign needed to persuade a much, much wider section of the population. At a national summit in Sydney in the year, at the end of the year 1976, the central demand of a uranium moratorium, a 5-year ban on uranium mining and exports, was adopted. Campaigners then set out to systematically win public support to this demand. Their first national initiative was a massive signature drive, which was designed to involve supporters in taking the debate directly to ordinary people. They used the petition as a way of putting out its arguments to the public. They distributed this uranium declaration to people who signed, explaining the movement's key demands. and ended up collecting 250,000 signatures in just a few months. Out of this, they built local groups that reached deep into the suburbs, and according to one estimate, by late 1977, there was more than 100 local groups active in Victoria alone. These groups organized local rallies, meetings, and events in the suburbs, building support in the lead up to major demonstrations in the city centres. So the first major demonstration that came about was in April 1977 that brought 10,000 people into the city. Later that year, a coordinated national protest saw 20,000 people march in both Melbourne and Sydney. These demonstrations are actually much smaller than some of the later demonstrations that would take place in the 80s, but the political impact was arguably much greater because the demands more directly confronted the government policy at the time. A Marxist historian, Tom O'Lincoln, noted that speakers at these rallies ranged from ALP left figures such as John Coxsedge and Tom Uren to Aboriginal speakers including Gary Foley and Marcia Langton. And the activists that participated at the time understood the importance of tying together those struggles. So one Brisbane activist reflected, if blacks got land rights, real land rights, then there would be a lot less uranium going out of this country. The major rallies also played an important role in bringing the movement together in all of its breadths. They really gave opponents of uranium mining a sense of how large the opposition was and built people's confidence to continue campaigning and to win. They also provided a way of recruiting new activists in the movement, which is actually the way that those major Palestine rallies could also be functioning in terms of bringing new people into the movement and then going away and doing that activism. But the mass demonstrations were just one part of the strategy, and now I want to turn to the other part, which is the direct actions designed to disrupt uranium exports. Central to this disruption was close cooperation between groups like the MUAM and rank-and-file unionists. Unionists helped facilitate motions across multiple unions calling on workers to boycott any work connected to uranium exports. A significant event that happened was in May of 1976, where a railway worker in Townsville was suspended from his job after refusing to load materials bound for the Mary Kathleen uranium mine in accordance with the policy of the Australian Railways Union. His suspension sparked a national railway strike, which eventually resulted in him being reinstated. But this action at the time was quite isolated because the movement was only starting to grow, and the conservative ACTU leaders succeeded in brokering an agreement to allow the transport of uranium from that mine on the basis that it was existing with union labour. Out of this really showed the possibilities of the power that workers had to shut down that production. But from that, the Friends of the Earth and activists developed a strategy of actually trying to consciously develop that relationship. So what you saw was Brisbane wharfies, working quite closely together with Friends of the Earth and warning activists about incoming uranium shipments and helping them get a bit of an understanding of how to best disrupt the port from the insides. From about in June, for about 3 days of June 1977, for 3 days, protesters occupied the docks in Sydney in an attempt to disrupt the export of yellowcake, uranium oxide ore. They were supported by rank-and-file wharfies, who stopped work in solidarity using the pretext of safety. Oh no, there's this rabble of activists on the port that are disrupting our work, to show their solidarity with the uranium anti-uranium cause. There's a vivid description of one historian gives of convoys carrying uranium traveling rapidly through the city, through Sydney, sometimes going the wrong way, down one-way streets, escorted by New South Wales and Commonwealth police, and police, trying to smash up and destroy that solidarity. And still at that time, the ACTU leadership was ambivalent and actually forced workers back to work. But by then, the action had made major headlines. 2 weeks later, there was another significant victory and a step forward. A West German ship carrying Australian uranium was stranded in the port as a result of a union boycott, organized very much on a similar basis. This ship, Columbus, Australia, was forced to leave behind around 1 million worth of cargo in Melbourne after more than 150 protesters shut it down for 24 hours alongside unionists who were acting against the wishes of their union leaders. This victory was not just a product of the direct action that was taken. Many of the unionists working on the wharves had been on those mass marches themselves. So there's a recollection of one, Alan Thompson, who was a unionist there at the time. Back then, everyone was aware of uranium mining. I was in the Job Delegates Association, and we used to invite speakers down at lunchtime. The anti-uranium demonstrations were some of the biggest since the Vietnam War, and we were used as marshals on them. Then we had to get on the wharf and load the bloody stuff. How do you think we felt? So in August of '77, the Fraser government went ahead and tried to expand uranium mining, approve full-scale expansion of this. And what then came about was 7 days, actually next day, 7 of Australia's biggest unions came out and declared their opposition, announcing their intention to move for a total ban on the mining and export of the uranium at the upcoming ACTU Congress. And despite the fact that that was shut down, you can see that those relationships that were developed made that possible. And despite the union of the conservative ACTU officials shutting that down, sections of the union movement continued to impose those bans. So the Transport Union went out alone, continued to ban shipments of uranium coming from the mines for export, and there continued to be support for banning uranium amongst rank and file members. I'm just conscious of time and I'm going way over, but I think where this then developed was you saw a number of workplaces developing rank and file networks that decided actually it's up onto us to impose these bans on our own accord. And so you had a number of workplaces such as metal shops, a number of metal shops in Brisbane imposing those bans. You saw in 1981 transport unions imposing new bans to stop uranium exports altogether, and you saw eventually that cascading into much more widespread opposition. Now, eventually, the ACTU leadership moved to wind down those trade union bans, and that movement kind of fizzled out. But I think looking at this movement as a whole, the movement managed to take an issue that had very limited public support initially and turn it into a major political controversy. They managed to mobilize hundreds of thousands of people, build local organizations around the country, and importantly, managed to shut down that export and production of uranium at the point of production. And I think the basis on which they were able to do that, those relationships that they were able to develop, and their orientation to the trade unions, that all of those things I think pose particularly rich lessons for the task for our movement today that hopefully comrades can draw out in the discussion.